This is Yusef here, and I watched part of James at Pandirasbox's his video. I think it's his latest one on Acharya S, where he's trying to get at the Christ mythers, and he's going through and basically shooting down Acharya S, and I think he did a very good job at it. But there's a few things that I'd like to expand, whether he agrees with me or not, on these. But I guess I'll make it as a reply, just as a complimentary to his video, which is something that I find very funny, is that people will say, well, Gautama of the Shakya, Siddhartha, the Buddha, not the only Buddha, because they thought Buddhas lived before and they had lived after him. And there's some in 16th century Japan and all that stuff, but talking about the character of Gautama of the Shakya, or Shakyamuni, or the Buddha when people refer to him. He supposedly lived somewhere between 500 and 600 years before the birth of Christ, before where we place the birth of Christ. And nothing was written about him until between 100 AD and 400 AD. That's being written, that's not traveling. And it seems that when people talk about stuff that happened in the East, they go to the extreme earliest, that there's a double standard, that if it has to do with anything Eastern, you use the earliest possible date, and oh, well, if even though it was written in 400 AD in either Sanskrit or Pali, that has to be totally accurate. And the fact that there's a 700 to 1,000 year gap between the historical figure and the writings that we have, and when we say the first written down, this is when they said this is when we started writing it down. Basically, they didn't say we compiled this from earlier sources, or there was another text, which even in the Torah they talk about, well, most of this can be found in the Book of the War. Well, we don't have the Book of the War, or the ending of John, I believe, say, well, there's countless tales and stories out there, but I can't fit them into this right now. And yet the Christ mythers like to pull everything out of whole cloth. They like to say, well, Jesus is Dionysius because Dionysius is the god of wine, and Jesus said to turn water into wine. Yet we find no other parallels. The strangest thing, and this is where I want to speak directly to James, the funniest thing is, in one of my videos, a atheist or whatever myther, the Christ myther, quoted from the Gospel of Matthew, where at the crucifixion, all these people started getting raised from the dead, and were walking around the city, and he said, see, this disproves it, because one, nobody can rise from the dead. Just taking a materialist view, but okay. Nobody can rise from the dead, and there's been no record, and this would have been recorded of people rising from the dead. And then he put two, the slaughter of the innocents at Bethlehem. If all these thousands of children were murdered, you'd think there'd be a historical note about it. Well, the first obvious problem is Jerusalem, where any records were kept, was burned to the ground, and Judea and the Galilee was basically razed to the ground by the Romans after Bar Kokhba, and they didn't want anything that smacked of any type of Jewish nationality, any records that they had, any religious. They didn't. I mean, that's why the things started getting stored in the caves at Qumran, because holy crap, what, look at this, the end of the world's coming, basically, as the Jews saw at the end of their nation. But the more obvious is Bethlehem is not even a village, was a hamlet. If you slaughtered all the children under the age of 5, what is that, 3 children? Maybe less? And even if it was a huge thriving village, the death at, I mean, the reason why we say people lived till 30 in ancient Egypt was because the infant mortality rate was sky high. Even if it was this huge, almost a city, you would probably have 10 children that would have been killed. Not huge city like Jerusalem, but just a very big village. You would have under 10 children being killed. And the cold-bloodedness of the Romans towards what they viewed as barbarian peoples, why the hell would they record it? And I mean, it just this is silly. The third thing you would think would be, well, these are embellishments. If anybody is looking for historical Jesus and they're an atheist, to rely on to look at things that are to see something fantastic and say, therefore there was no Jesus, therefore Jesus of Nazareth never existed. Well, there's the embellishments in Alexander the Great, in the stories of Alexander the Great, which were written hundreds of years after Alexander the Great, have shiny flying shields coming down from the sky and zapping people. Well, maybe that's proof to them, see, because it's an alien spaceship helping Alexander the Great with death rays. In the life of almost any great man in history, we have these miraculous apocalyptic events around their birth, and in the greatest in their what's called the greatest moments of their life, what they're remembered for. There's all these strange things happening, or the heavens splitting open, or a tree talking to them, or something like that. Buddha was said to have been born crystal clear, and it wasn't even a virgin birth. He came straight out of his mother's side. And I had somebody say that, well, I mean, the video that you referenced, the infidel guy, to speaking to Bart Ehrman, he is really an ignorant ass and very arrogant, very arrogant. Ignorance doesn't bother me. It's the arrogance that people have while being ignorant is what gets me. Every scholar, well, Bart Ehrman is a leading scholar in his field, and I think he brought him on his show since he knows that a lot of the many, especially evangelical Christians, but any Protestants do not like Bart Ehrman at all. And he's seen almost as the Antichrist, that he thought he'd bring him on the show and be like, oh yeah, see, this proves, where Bart Ehrman's like, no, I'm a historian, this does not, no, there was a Jesus of Nazareth. With going to Acharya S, okay, so when Bart Ehrman says all the serious scholars I know in my field, he's talking about thousands of people. And I know the atheists love to discount, well, if you claim to be a Christian or believe anything that could be seen as supernatural in the Bible, you're discredited, which is very funny because that doesn't work in any other area of study or science or anything else. My church was near Fermilab, which was the most advanced place for particle physics before the Large Hadron Collider was built. And many of them went to my church. Does that affect their work with science? I mean, it's screwy. But with Acharya S, not even the Jesus Seminar, which I know you know what the Jesus Seminar, some people might not know what it is. It's people like Marvin Myers, John Dominic Carson, I think Bishop John Shelby Spong was part of it. These are people who say, well, there's no virgin birth, there was no resurrection, there was no this, there was no that. But they found things original to Christ, or even the things that they said, well, if somebody else said it before, we're not going to attribute it to Jesus. And they found things, they thought they got down to the historical Christ. The idea that Jesus was a compilation of myths is beyond lunacy. And to say, oh, well, these accounts were written, 40 to 60 years after Christ's death. Okay. So, by that logic, all of the people who had witnessed World War II or the gas chambers or anything, they're not reliable. Right now, they're not reliable. In fact, the people who witnessed Vietnam are not reliable. Could not write a book about it. Could not give any accurate information about it. If we see how close the Gospels were written to the actual events, it's astonishing and it's amazing, especially for ancient times, especially for 2,000 years ago. I'm agreeing with James in Pandirasbox at Pandirasbox in this video. I'm not trying to argue with him. I just want to expand more on it, but I got to give him credit, since when I saw that, I'm like, I got to say something about this. So when people, oh, well, it was written decades after. Okay, so your uncle who was in Vietnam, he can't tell you anything accurate that happened in Vietnam, or what people's names were, or who got shot at, at different places, at Khe Sanh or places like that. Acharya S, Joseph, well, I won't include Joseph Campbell in this. What's that one guy's name? Oh, I'm blanking on him. The guy that says God is dog spelled backward. I know I'm going to remember it after this video ends, but just foolishness. And then I had people who repeat stuff from the Cult of Dusty saying Tacitus, Pliny, and Josephus are all forgeries, and any mention of Jesus or any biblical character in them is a forgery. And their reasoning is, well, we don't have the original copies. Well, look at from when we have this stuff from. Well, the commentaries of Caesar, the oldest copies we have are from the 14th century. About the same for Alexander the Great. So you're going to have to start wiping out whole swaths of history. And they say, oh, archaeology disproves the Bible. Really? I think they got that from an episode of Bullshit by Penn and Teller, or where Michael Shermer, who is not a biblical scholar or an archaeologist, says that, even though pretty much all the cities that are mentioned in the Bible we can find, and the wars that took place, they find the Babylonian siege with Babylonian arrowheads and massive burning. So this is to all Christ mythers. I made a video about Christ mythers just 12 hours ago, dealing with Pliny, Tacitus, Celsus, Josephus, and the other morons. But I felt compelled to make this, and I'm going to remember the guy's name in a minute when this ends. Joseph something or other, I don't know, I forget. But if there's any atheists out there, do you realize when you say these things about Pliny or Tacitus or these mythers, you are grouping yourself into such a stupid category. And then they come back with, well, just because Jesus existed doesn't mean he's the Son of God or he performed miracles. Exactly. That's exactly right. You're exactly right. Except when you go to the extreme to say that Jesus never existed, when it was extremely well documented from what we have. To say that is silly. Peace to you. May God save Serbia. And there's the Eastern Orthodox sign on Acharya S, where he's trying to get at the Christ mythers, and he's going through and basically shooting down Acharya S, and I think he did a very good job at it. But there's a few. This is Yusef here, and I watched part of James at Pandirasbox's his video. I think it's his latest one. Things that I'd like to expand, whether he agrees with me or not, on these. But I guess I'll make it as a reply, just as a complimentary to his video, which is something that I find very funny, is that people will say, well, Gautama of the Shakya, Siddhartha, the Buddha, not the only Buddha, because they thought Buddhas lived before and they had lived after him. And there's some in, 16th century Japan and all that stuff, but talking about the character of Gautama of the Shakya, or Shakyamuni, or the Buddha when people refer to him. He supposedly lived somewhere between